On February 13th, 1692, Boston minister Cotton Mather wrote to one of the most influential members of his church, Major John Richards, who would later serve on the Salem Court of Oyer and Terminer. Cotton wrote, "It is time for churches to do some remarkable thing in the matter of returning unto God." He then asked Richards to approve a service for members to renew their commitments to the covenant that they had signed to join the church. However, the other man disagreed with the necessity of such a service. Welcome to Salem Witch Trials Daily. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
Hi, I'm Sarah. For the accused, refusing to confess was often a matter of spiritual integrity. They believed that lying would leave a stain on their souls and that they would have to answer for that before God.
Here are some examples of people from the Salem Witch Trials who refused to confess. And, well, actually, I want to say something before we get into the examples. Of the 19 people who were hanged for witchcraft, 18 of them refused to confess, and the 19th recanted his confession. And here are some examples of those who refused to confess despite serious pressure. Rebecca Nurse. She was an elderly, reputedly pious woman who stated, "I am as innocent as the child unborn." She never pointed a finger at another person or admitted to guilt despite the pressure of being accused by her own community.
Another elder, George Jacob Sr., stood resolutely against all the charges against him, and he challenged the magistrates with the famous line, "You tax me for a wizard, you might as well tax me for a buzzard." He declared he would stand in the truth of Christ, even if it meant burning or hanging.
And Susannah Martin, when asked if she would confess, she declared, "I dare not tell a lie if it would save my life."
John Willard was accused of terrible murders with witchcraft, but he refused to confess, stating, "If it was the last time I was to speak, I am innocent."
In Connecticut, in the witch trials, there was Goody Knapp. In a 1653 trial, she remained silent and refused to accuse Mary Staples despite being pressured by other women to name names before her execution.
Also earlier in Boston, Margaret Jones, the first person executed in Massachusetts, when visited in prison, she still refused to belie herself and said she was wholly free from it.
While many stood firm, at least 54 people in 1692 did confess. And there are many reasons that they did confess. There are many factors that led to them making these statements. Samuel Wardwell was a carpenter and well-known fortune teller from Andover who initially confessed to making a pact with a prince of the air and afflicting others, likely in an attempt to save his life. However, driven by his conscience, he recanted this confession before the grand jury on September 13th, 1692, declaring his previous statements false and refusing to lie to try to save himself. Despite his retraction, the magistrates used his original confession as evidence to convict him, making him the only confessor to be executed during the Salem witch trials. He was hanged on September 22nd, 1692, where a cloud of smoke from the executioner's pipe choked him during his final protest of innocence, an event his accusers interpreted as the devil silencing him.
A rumor spread, particularly in Andover, that those who confessed would be spared execution, leading families to pressure their loved ones to admit guilt to save their lives. However, this rumor had no basis, and people who confessed were condemned, though many of them were ultimately reprieved by the governor.
And physical pressure was applied to some of the suspects, such as binding suspects' neck and heels. John Proctor wrote to the governor about what amounted to the torture of Martha Carrier's sons, who were bound until the blood ran from their noses. Then they testified against their mother.
Tituba, the first to confess in Salem, provided the magistrates with the story they wanted to hear. This was a self-preservation strategy.
And I want to talk about some actions that were taken by people that showed that they knew they were going to die and still refused to confess. Like, let's look at Mary Esty's petition. Mary Esty, the sister of Rebecca Nurse, is noted for her eloquent petition to the court, written after she had been condemned to die. She accepted her own fate, but begged the governor and judges to proceed differently to prevent the shedding of more innocent blood. She suggested that the magistrates examine the afflicted persons separately and try some of the confessors, as she was confident that many confessors were actually innocent people lying in an attempt to save their lives. In her petition, she wrote, "The Lord above knows my innocency then, and likewise does now, as of the great day will be known to men and angels." And lots of people are familiar with the story of Giles Cory, the man who wasn't executed by hanging like the other 19 individuals that we've talked about, but he was killed by being pressed to death by stones because he refused to stand trial. When he was asked if he would stand trial by God and country, which meant by the court and the jury, he declined to answer. And so weights were piled on him using this method called peine forte et dure, which was pressing to death. He was placed under a board and heavy stones were piled onto that board one by one. And he was asked each time, "Will you stand trial? Will you stand trial?" And he refused to stand trial no matter what, because he knew by this point in the trials, everybody who'd gone to court had been convicted and condemned. And he knew it was a lost cause. He didn't want to go to death as a convicted witch. So he refused to stand the trial. Instead of submitting to the court's authority, he endured the crushing weight until he died on September 19th, 1692. The graphic novel More Weight by Ben Wicke is titled after his famous Defiance.